Hello, and depending on where you are joining the second evidence-based research conference from, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I am delighted to join you all today, and I am honored to have been invited by the conference organizing committee to continue the conversation about the role of evidence-based research, or EBR, as well known to many of us attending the conference, within the evidence ecosystem. The conference organizing committee gave me the task of answering the question, does evidence-based research fit within the evidence ecosystem? In first contemplating how to answer this question, I thought that there could be several possible answers. For example, not at all. Yes, but only in terms of certain aspects of the ecosystem. And yes, throughout the entire evidence ecosystem. Although I am perhaps spoiling the ending, I will tell you that my answer is yes. Evidence-based research fits throughout the evidence ecosystem. And I will spend the remainder of the presentation conveying why I believe this to be true, and look forward to your thoughts as to whether you are in agreement or have a difference of opinion during the question and answer period to follow. However, before I share with you my rationale for why I think evidence-based research fits within the evidence ecosystem, I think it is important that I provide you with a working definition of evidence-based research. In addition to incorporating one's scientific environment and context, personal interests and ambitions, and the knowledge base, I consider an evidence-based approach as systematically and transparently acknowledging and using the existing body of evidence throughout the entire research process. Specific points of the research process that the evidence-based research community has commented on include the use of existing evidence when justifying and planning a new study, and placing the results of the new study in context. When evidence-based research was first defined, prior research was thought to be synonymous with systematic reviews. However, acknowledging advancements in our thinking, I believe we have now broadened our thoughts of prior research to evidence syntheses, or even broader, to existing evidence. Now back to the question at hand. As previously identified by Dr. Van Wyk, there are several evidence ecosystem models, but as was pointed out in his co-authored paper in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, the models agree on the need to increase value and reduce waste through production of more relevant and reliable evidence. Thus, an almost exact fit of what we hope the impact of evidence-based research will be, with the common goal amongst the different evidence ecosystems. With the time I have today, I'm going to focus on the fit of the evidence-based research within the digital and trustworthy evidence ecosystem presented by Dr. Van Wyk. For those familiar with evidence-based research, the fit of evidence-based research in the ecosystem might be quite apparent. Perhaps at first glance, you see what I see, a fit within the produced evidenced component. Although I consider evidence-based research to have a direct and almost perfect fit here, I would propose going one step further to suggest a modification to the produced evidence component to formally integrate evidence-based research by adding planned, conducted, and disseminated using an EBR approach. The planning and conducted to capture the justification and design of the research within existing evidence and end user perspectives, and the disseminated to capture the placement of the results in the context of existing evidence. This said, I do think that another approach could be suggested, and that is to add another synthesized evidence component, which would inform the produced evidence component. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on which approach might best convey the fit of the evidence ecosystem and evidence-based research. As I've touched upon already, and well known to our evidence-based research community, existing evidence, and better yet, synthesized evidence, is one of the key components to the evidence-based research approach. Thus, synthesized evidence is likely another area where one would identify that there is a direct fit for evidence-based research within the evidence ecosystem. This being said, and consistent with the definition of evidence-based research that I offered at the beginning of the presentation, I would suggest a slight modification to the evidence ecosystem to change the term systematic reviews to evidence syntheses. Patient care decision aids are tools that help people become involved in decision-making by making explicit the decision that needs to be made, providing information about options and outcomes, and by clarifying personal values. Patient care decision aids range in their rigor of development, and as such, the International Patient Decision Aid Standards Collaboration established a set of internationally approved criteria for determining the quality of patient decision aids. Two components of this criteria are that the patient decision aid or associated documentation describes how research evidence was selected or synthesized, and that the patient decision aid or associated documentation describes the quality of the research evidence used. Thus, another place within the evidence ecosystem where there is a fit for evidence-based research is within the produce and disseminate guidance component. An evidence-based research approach can be applied to the development of patient decision aids. First and foremost, patient decision aids are designed to take into account the end user perspective, which is consistent with the evidence-based research approach. They also use existing evidence to inform the presentation of benefits and harms. And this said, there's an existing Cochrane systematic review by Don Stacy and colleagues that actually synthesizes the evidence on decision aids for people facing treatment or screening decisions, which would be where to start when justifying the need to develop a new patient care decision aid from an evidence-based research approach. I also see evidence-based research having a role within the implement and evaluate component in the evidence ecosystem. I see this particularly relating to the area of implementation science. For those of you who may not be familiar with implementation science, it is the scientific study of methods to promote the uptake of research findings into routine healthcare in clinical, organizational, or policy contexts. Given that implementation science undertakes the same process in order to produce evidence, evidence-based research applies to implement and evaluate in the same way it applies to produced evidence in the evidence ecosystem. Let me give you an example. In a 2016 Lancet publication by Noah Ivers and Jeremy Grimshaw, They concluded that for more than a decade, existing evidence identified that audit and feedback was an effective way to improve care. But new studies continued to undertake the study of audit and feedback versus usual care alone, testing whether a particular version of audit and feedback could work in one particular setting for one particular purpose. Thus, in implementing and evaluating evidence within the ecosystem and applying an evidence-based research approach as offered by Noah Ivers and Jeremy Grimshaw, this could have improved the value of these implementation studies and reduced waste by considering alternative comparators instead of only standard care placebo, and using alternative methods such as sequential trials of interventions to compare various design components with embedded process evaluations. Using one of the examples from Dr. Van Vick's presentation that he so kindly shared with me, I wanted to provide an illustration of evidence-based research role within the evidence ecosystem. As was shared with us already, there was a systematic review that confirms no benefit of subacromial decompression surgery for adults with shoulder pain. And this review informed the development of BMJ rapid recommendations and other guidance, which then in turn informed the implementation of a national de-investment strategy in Norway. Thinking about the role of evidence-based research within this example, for produced and disseminate guidance, an evidence-based research approach could be used to develop patient care decision aids, which actually these decision aids have been developed and are available from BMJ Rapid Recommendations and the Magic app. And for implement and evaluate, an evidence-based research approach could be used to plan, conduct, and disseminate implementation science studies to evaluate the effect of strategies used to de-implement subacromial decompression surgery for adults with shoulder pain. And applying an evidence-based research approach, the systematic review would hopefully prevent a design and conduct of a new study evaluating subacromial decompression surgery for adults with shoulder pain and inform a new study, if there is going to be one, that would evaluate the evidence gaps. For example, alternatives to surgery. Lastly, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that the core elements, the core requirements or cogwells showed here that allow for the functioning of the evidence ecosystem are shared with the evidence-based research approach. Take, for example, the requirement for common methodology and standards. Within FBRACE, Working Group 2 is focusing on the development and teaching of methods to be evidence-based when doing clinical research. And their work has led to training schools that aim to promote a common methodology or process for applying an evidence-based research approach. Or another example, tools and platforms. As an evidence-based research approach involves the production and or updating of evidence syntheses, the tools and platforms required within the evidence ecosystem for systematic reviews are a shared requirement for evidence-based research. And now a few final thoughts. I'm certain that my first concluding remark on this slide is not a surprise. My hope is that through this presentation, I provided support for this conclusion, yet I do recognize that there could be other examples that do demonstrate a fit of evidence-based research and the evidence ecosystem, but that there also may be diverging opinions, and I look forward to hearing those. However, given the fit that I proposed and consistent with the goal that we are trying to achieve with an evidence-based research approach, to create a new evidence ecosystem for evidence-based research, in my opinion, would be wasteful. Therefore, I challenge our evidence-based research community to work to improve existing evidence ecosystems, such as the digital and trustworthy evidence ecosystem presented here today, to improve and be more explicit about evidence-based research's role within the evidence ecosystem. Thank you all for your time, and I look forward to taking your questions.